All right, folks, welcome back to another video here with Top Comics Pressing. In this case, we have 24 comic books in a pile here, and we're just going to go through and pre-screen these, kind of how we had been in some of the other videos. And in this particular case, I want to point out that the owner of these asked me to use a pretty high bar for what to let through to press. So the average target grade here is 9.6, 9.8, perhaps with a few exceptions on these older books, but generally we're looking for a very high bar, and that means we're going to have a pretty high bounce or decline rate in this particular case. Oh, and the other reason I say to do that is because, you know, if you're really looking for the most profitability on all of the time and work you put into this, you're really looking for those really high grade books. And CGC is not going to do any favors. And so I encourage people to be very strict with their own books and start to look at some of the very fine defects that you might expect or see. So in this case, we have a kind of pseudo-iconic, semi-iconic. It's one of the more issue covers of the Wonder Woman series that was kind of popular in the early 70s. So this is issue 196 from 1971. And there's this very kind of odd era where Wonder Woman has kind of a white outfit. And anyway, they're pretty fun. But this one I think is going to be a decline to slab. And the reason for that isn't necessarily just because of some of the light spine stress lines that we can see all the way down here. It really has to do with the damage on this edge over here. This, by the way, looks like it's a printer crease, that white line kind of coming on in from the edge there. It has the kind of distinctive squiggle of a printer's crease, but all of this along here, so if we look very carefully, we can see those color breaks, and so there's a lot of edge wear, particularly if we get up here. You can definitely see it. And CGC is going to call all of that creasing, and they're really going to hammer this issue because of all this very, very light creasing. It's not that obvious from arm's length. You really have to get up and look at it, and you can see kind of all that just very minor surface wear that one sees. And so because of that, I think that copy is going to be a decline. Now here's a couple more. These are the Peter Parker Spectacular Spider-Man number 27. So I believe this is the first Frank Miller Daredevil. So it's kind of a mini key for the very hardcore Frank Miller collectors. And this one on first glance looks super sharp. And so I don't see anything horribly wrong with the corners and the edges as we kind of roll around this. But I think this one we're going to decline because of this very faint white line here right between the spine and the Marvel TV Sensation. So that looks like CGC to me. To me, in person, this one actually looks like a scratch, not a crease. But CGC, I think, is going to count that as a vertical spine stress line, as if somebody had had the book folded open and had kind of tugged or creased along that. So that kind of vertical damage along the spine is quite common on Silver Age books, particularly those that have more worn spines. And as you can see, it's a pretty long line. And so I think because of that, that book might max out as low as a 6, even though it looks to be a very high-grade copy with the exception of that white line. And you can see this other copy here does not have that white line in that same spot. This one I think we are going to proceed with. It is a much, much sharper copy. It has a few very minor spine tick lines. So we can see one of those right here above Spider-Man's elbow. Right there, and another one right here below Spider-Man's elbow. But I think a couple of very fine spine ticks. This one, hopefully after a press, we'll get up to a 9.6, and I don't see anything, you know, noteworthy or exceptional on the back. And so I think this one is definitely going to be a put in a slab category. Contrasts pretty significantly with this one. So this is the exact same issue. Again, you'll notice that there's no vertical white line there. The reason I bring that up is when you have multiple issues of the same comic, you can go through and figure out if things are manufacturing or not, usually from that. And in this case, we have one that does have that white line and 2 copies that don't have that white line. And so I think it actually is something wrong with that particular copy. But this one, you can see, has a whole host of spine lines. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. If we gently turn it inside, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, and we have some impact damage there on the bottom corner. This is more severe than just a binding chip, so you can see that it has a little bit of damage increasing along there. So at some point this comic was probably in a box that got dropped. And if we look really carefully up here, we can see we have a little bit of some white lines there. Now we can press that flat, but those horizontal white lines are going to stay there for good. And so this issue, I think, while still very nice, would probably rate in maybe the 8.5 category after cleaning it all the way up, and that's going to be below our very high 9496 threshold. So we're going to go ahead and put that one in the decline pile. Here we go. This is Hamilton's Mighty Morphin Power Rangers #1. It's a little bit harder to find a copy from the 90s. Hamilton is obviously not one of the major publishers of the time, and so I think this had a slightly smaller print run than some of the other big 90s books. This one has a couple of things wrong with it. It's got a little bit of surface damage here on the back. We can look and see that it has a couple of spine lines that are very clearly visible. The staple, while misplaced, is not going to affect the grade, although we can see that there are very slight tears around that staple, likely as a function of it being misplaced and then having the comic book opened up. There is a little bit of edge wear right here on the top corner, so that's very minor, but it is real and it's there, and a pristine copy would not have it. And we can see again, this is spine stress from the staple, a spine line, spine line, spine line, and then a little bit of a corner bend over here. So I think after a press, this one's probably going to come in the 9.2 range, and that again is going to fall short of our very high bar, and so we're going to go ahead and table that one as a decline. Here we go, Captain Atom. Now this is you know, a much older comic here, so 1966, solidly in the Silver Age. And, you know, there's some hype about the Blue Beetle now that James Gunn has taken over the DC. And so this might be one that we might be inclined to slab. Unfortunately, when I flipped this comic over, I could kind of feel just how rough this paper was, and you can see that there's a lot of foxing down here on the corner, and there's a lot of foxing up here. Now, I can remove foxing, but in this particular copy, I'm not going to be able to help it out, and the reason is if you look very carefully under the foxing, you can see that the gloss has been fully deteriorated over here. So right there, you can kind of see in that shimmer, the line where the paper has been eaten through, and that follows all the way around this book. And so this book was wet or put against something that was wet, and you actually destroyed some of the fibers. So if you look especially in there, that's not foxing in that particular location. That's actually the paper of the comic cover being pulled up, and then we have a nice long crease right through here that you can kind of see. And so because of that, this one I'm going to go ahead and put in the declined copy or decline pile. For a book of that era, it's still in really nice shape, but it's not going to be one that we're going to be able to get a high grade at CGC with. Moving on to the Uncanny X-Men #149 here. If we just gently roll the light around, you can see that there's a lot of finger bends in here. Now, some of those will press out, especially over here, and we might be able to have a big improvement on a press on this particular copy. And if you go down the spine, it doesn't look that bad. So we got one small tick there, another tick, 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 tick. But unlike that Peter Parker and the Spectacular Spider-Man, these are much finer ticks. And so because of that, you can have a lot more of them. So remember, CGC does it based on the length going in is a horizontal measure by the number of ticks, and then also how much color or paper is there. So, you know, some ticks don't break color, and then some like this do break color, but you have to really zoom in to be able to see it. And then other ones, as they become more moderate, you know, actually become tears as the fibers separate and split. And so these all look to me to be very nice, small lines, and nothing too crazy, but I am going to recommend to decline this one because of some damage over here. And it's very subtle, but if you look, there is a vertical crease that goes right from here through that light beam that Nightcrawler is holding and up into his hand there. Let me see if I can hold it right there. And that is not going to press out. I can make the paper flat, but if you look in there, you can see that the fiber is damaged and the gloss is damaged. And so while I can press it flat, CGC is definitely going to pick up on that. And that's definitely going to knock this out of the above 9.0 category. And so we're going to go ahead and put that one on the decline pile. Now, this one I was on the fence about. This of course, is the epic Jim Lee X-Men #4, first appearance of Omega Red. Used to be kind of a dollar box comic, and now it's gotten a lot more popularity, and it's no longer in the dollar boxes. However, this was a very highly printed run, and there are an exceptional number of 9.6 and 9.8 copies of this book out there. If this were a more rare copy, or more rare comic, I probably would recommend slabbing this one. But in this particular case, I think it's best to decline because we do have some moderate spine stress lines right there. They're kind of starting to double up. There's one right here by the tentacle. We have a little bit of creasing around the corner here. So particularly what I'm looking for is that kind of horizontal line right there on the corner. So that's going to count against us. And then on the back, you know, these spine lines are going to be quite visible. So they're going to be there and then through here by Magneto. And then as you go down to the corner here, you definitely can see that. So could I press this book? Yes. Could I improve it? Yes. Will it be above a 9.0 copy after I worked on it? Most likely. But I don't think it'll hit that 9.6, 9.4 threshold. And so I think it's one that is probably best to decline. Now, these two had a note on them only to accept if they were 9/8. These are a Batman Annual number 14 from 1990. You'll notice that these have the square bound construction, so there is no staple on the side of these, and that's because they are glued internally, and so you have to press these differently. It's a slightly more delicate process. Now, it's easy to make 9.8 rejects, and the reason for that is you just have to find some defects. And so right here is a spine stress line you can see kind of in the glare, and then there's going to be another one right down here. Now, some of those can press out, but this one very clearly does break color, and I don't think I'll be able to hide that from CGC. So because of that, I think that one is best to be put in the decline pile, as is this next copy for the exact same reason. So I'm assuming that these were side by side, but there are about 3 or 4 very small spine lines right in that same area. And there's one more here, kind of in the brighter fuchsia color right there that you can see. And so because of that, we're going to decline those because the note and the target was 9.8 only. Fantastic Four number 258. Again, I'm just going to hold this up and go right down the spine. And you can see that there, again, is some very minor staple tears. CGC really hates those staple tears. And so you want to be aware of and familiar with that. The other thing to look out for is staple rust. So we'll have some examples of that. But this is now 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 ticks, and so that one again I think is going to be a little hard to hit 9.4 on, so we're going to go ahead and decline that one. Ghost Rider number 1. So this thing looks pristine from the front cover, very nice, and that is especially hard to get on the black. And if I turn it sideways here now, you will notice some of this very minor chipping. Those aren't spine ticks. That paper is still flat there. That is damage that occurred when this book was folded from one flat sheet and folded over. The paper kind of very subtly started to separate where it was creased for that fold. That is allowable at a 9.8, and so I'm not going to worry too much about that. Like you can see it right here by that Spider-Man logo. Those little bits of white is where that paper was originally folded over, and that is going to be okay. This one does have a defect that I think will keep it from being a 9.8, and that is color rub back here. So again, if we go look at the space rip by the staple, you can see that there's some ink rubbed off and there's some ink transferred right there. And then down here on the purple, you can see that there's a very slight amount of ink rub. And that happened because somebody took this comic and they dropped it in presumably a brand new bag and a board, and it slid across the back and all that ink rubbed onto the backer board. And so again, you don't want to do that. You want to take the board out, put the comic on the board, and then gently slide that on. Nevertheless, if the line here is 9.6, I think that one will make a 9.6, and so we're going to go ahead and put that in the accept pile. Now, this copy or comic we are going to have a pile of. So the person has a whole stack of these Sensational She-Hulk number 1s, of course, breaking the fourth rail or third rail or whatever. And we have the kind of self-homage here to the original Savage She-Hulk number 1 on the cover. For whatever reason, I see these predominantly in newsstand. So even though this book is from 1989, so in that era, you would think that you would have a very small percentage of newsstand and a very high percentage of direct copies. This one I only almost ever see in newsstand, so I always want to be aware of that. This one I am going to decline for 2 reasons. One of which is if you look right here, here, there is a pretty big bend on that corner. And again, in principle, that will press out. But again, if you look very carefully into the fibers, you can see that they are damaged in there. And so the way I'm judging that is I'm looking for kind of a matte, dull line in the center of that bend. And if I see a matte, dull line, I think that means that it's busted gloss. The other reason is the staples are recessed in here. And so if I kind of hold my finger carefully against that staple, you can see that the staple is indeed pushed into that comic book. Recessed staples sometimes will happen during a comic book press. If somebody has done a bad job of supporting the center staple, you can get them to be recessed. It's also a manufacturing thing, and the one down here is quite bad. So I think the max issue grade that this comic is going to get with these two heavily recessed staples would be an 8.5 by CGC. Some comics do have recessed staples on almost all of them, and in that case it is considered more of a publication, or sorry, a printing defect. But, you know, we can look here and compare it to another issue, and the staples on this one are right where you'd expect them to be. And so it's not a printing or manufacturing defect. At least it wouldn't be considered on this one. Now here again, being very stringent, we can see we have one spine tick right here in that right there. And then we have another one up here. This one's a little bit bigger and much more obvious, I think. And then we have some very small tear and some chipping up top. Now this could be confused with a gripper, but the grippers are usually about a third of the way through. And so this is too far away from the corner to be a binding tear, and it's not quite centered enough to be a gripper tear. And so I think that's going to be seen by CGC as a true tear. And so between the tear and the spine ticks, this one is a pretty clear decline for me. This one would be in really great shape if it were not for this really big spine stress line. And again, I've mentioned that the CGC gauges these both on number, based on severity, and based on length. And so ones like this right there, that is a very, very, very fine spine stress line that only shows up in the glare, and it barely breaks color, if at all. But this one now is quite long, and you can see it goes, you know, at least a big finger's width. And if we flip it on over, it's even longer on the back. So that one is going to be a decline due to that extra long spine stress line. This copy looks really sharp, but one thing that you cannot see is that it feels really gritty. It has a weird texture to it compared to all the other ones, and I think that's because it was exposed to something in the elements or sat on top of another comic. And you can see it has kind of some weird surface dirt and grime right there, kind of by my thumb, as well as over here. And if we flip it on over, there's a lot more of it here on the back. Now, in principle, I might be able to clean some of that off and polish it on up with a couple of techniques, but even if I did that, we'd still have the spine stress lines, and there's a bunch more color rub here. We have a pretty severe binding tear, if not corner damage, and you can see that some of that has removed color, as well as we have these spine stress lines down there. And so even if it weren't for that weird kind of grittiness, I think this one would struggle to hit 9.4 with some of the other defects and surface damage, and so that one is going to be a decline for a couple of reasons. This one, I think, has a decent shot of pressing up to that mark. There is a little bit of a wiggle or a finger crease right in here. So I'll have to think about that, but I think that CGC, if that's the only thing that they catch and flag it for, we'll probably give it a 9.6 for that one line, or maybe a 9.4. So, but that's at least in the ballpark of what we're aiming for there. We should be able to press out a lot of these other things. You'll notice that this one does not have the color rub on the back, and it again has a nice smooth kind of surface. And the side also looks really nice. There's not a whole lot going on with the spine. So I think this one's worth giving a press and rolling the dice on. Next up here is another copy. This one has one recessed staple. You can see right there, and that is unfortunate because I think that is ultimately going to kind of bounce or reject this one. That would otherwise be a very nice issue. The top staple is only very moderately recessed, but unfortunately the bottom one is pretty much chalked in there. You can kind of see the pretty big kind of U shape right by that 1988, right above the John Byrne signature. This one is, I think, going to be a really beautiful 9.6 in a slab, maybe 9.8 if we can hide. There's a single spine line right there that I found, and maybe a little bit there. But I think this one, after a press, has a decent shot of making a 9.8. If not, for sure, it should make a 9.6. And so I think that this one is going to go in an R2 press pile. Another one of the sensational She-Hulk covers here is number 34. Again, very clean. This little bit of white right there, I believe happened when it was folded over, so I'm not going to consider that damage. That was manufacturing or production. And again, very, very sharp copy here. And so I think this one's going to be headed for, again, that 9.6 category, maybe 9.8 if we do a good job with the press. So very, very sharp copy. Again, this very small tear up here on the top corner, that is your binding tear, and that's going to be really common on anything from this era that was folded and then cut up there. So very nice on that one. And we're happy to hear she thrives on controversy. Okay, this one here we're going to decline for a couple of reasons. We've got some goobies up here that may or may not clean off. Sometimes when I clean those off, I also end up with a little bit of color rub, and I think that's mostly because the underlying gloss and ink is damaged underneath there and you just can't see it. But my favorite way to approach this would be first a cotton round and then a very damp, very light cotton round, but you can see that there's a lot of splatter across there. There's also a vertical spine line, and that might press out, but we want to keep a look on that. It does not look like it breaks color, but it's definitely there. The bigger issue on this particular copy is that it has the start of a spine split. And for whatever reason on this sensational She-Hulk #1, I very commonly do see them with spine splits. And you can see it's starting, it's about probably a ½ inch right now up across there. And it's something you want to check if you're buying one of these out in the wild, is just make sure that that spine is still secure and not split. It's pretty subtle, it's pretty easy to overlook. You can see it's starting on the top as well, and it happens, I think, just because these were machined kind of poorly, as you can see from the number that have recessed staples as well. All right, Star Wars #4, pretty epic. Man, this is a first printing, goes all the way back to the original Star Wars story, A New Hope. But as cool of a book as it is, and as happy as a lot of people would be to add it to their collection, we're not going to be able to hit that high mark with it. And part of it is, if you look right here across the top, it's very subtle, but there is, again, some of that edge wear increasing. Right there, you can see it in the glare. And if you look down straight at it, it does break color, especially above the A in Marvel and the R in Marvel. And so because of that, that will not press out. It's quite subtle. But in addition to that, even if CGC missed that or wasn't paying full attention, there is a whole smorgasbord here of spine ticks starting kind of at the UPC, and you kind of just see them go up. And so while this copy would probably rate in the 8.5 to 9.0 category, it's going to fall short of that very high threshold. And so we're going to put that one in our decline bucket. Our Army at War. You know, a nice, very early Silver Age book. In general, it looks quite nice from the front. The problem is when you flip it on over again, you see this foxing. And so you can see the foxing across the top. That foxing is fixable on a lot of comics, and you can see kind of just that brown rust color as you scroll around here. So nothing too crazy or exceptional there. Could fix it up. In this case, I don't think the owner wants to. And you can see kind of the tanning and the foxing on the interior. But for a 1965 book, it's in really good shape. One of the other defects that I think sneaks up on people is, again, staple rust. And so for older books, especially if they don't look like they have shiny staples, this one definitely looks rusted. And if you see rust on the outside, I encourage you to go look on the inside at that centerfold and see if you see any rust there. And in this case, if we look really carefully in there, you can see that rust has started to transfer to the interior pages. And so this is the start of what would be called staple rust with migration. You can see that there is rust embedded on there on the paper. And so one to decline for now. Still plenty readable, still a lot of fun, but I don't think it's one that will grade highly, and it's not that popular in terms of war books. All right, last book here, Batman #6 from the New 52 era. So I think this one is credited as the first appearance of the Court of Owls. And you can kind of scroll down the spine here and see that there are some spine ticks. None of them are super big. They just look really horrible because this cover is super glossy. You can see some finger bends there, and you can see a scratch up there. This one, I think, you know, might be able to make that above 9.0 after a press. But I think, you know, for a book that's not super popular and that has a lot of 9.8s and 9.6s out there, this one too is probably best set to a decline. So you can see another tick right there. This amount of corner wear is probably on the edge of being dinged for it. You can see mostly I'm more concerned about the white on the bottom than I am about the white down here on the corner. So it's the little bit here right by my thumb. Not that'll go away as a binding or manufacturing and get overlooked, but I think it's that that is slightly more concerning. Still a very nice copy, but I don't think that it's going to make that 9.6 threshold at CGC even after a press. Particularly on this exact era of paper, finger bends sometimes are quite stubborn, and again, it's because the gloss is broken under there. So right now I can feel it's rough, but I bet you even if I press this, iron it, and press it again, there's still going to be a little bit of a line here. It won't be as bad, it won't be as big, but it won't fully come out because it's quite a deep of a finger bend. Right here, this probably will come out. It doesn't have the same depth, and I think that bend right kind of above the Batman logo would go fully unnoticed. But this really deep finger bend here is never going to come out 100%, even though you'd like it to. It'll still show up in the glare because that gloss will be damaged. All right, so that was it for this video. Much harsher, much higher bar. So I think we only have a couple of issues here really that we're gonna press, maybe just a handful. And so a pretty high reject or decline rate, but all in all, I think it'll be beneficial to the owner of these to be a little bit more stringent, so that they're not surprised at CGC. All right, if you continue to get value out of these, please go ahead and like, subscribe, tell a friend, follow on Facebook or Instagram, and most of all, thank you for viewing.